Great, hi everyone. It's really good to be here. It's been a really enjoyable day so far. My name's Natalya. I'm here with my colleague Guido, and we are going to talk to you about a project we've been working on Decolonising Travel Studies. So I'm going to kick us off and tell you a bit about the project before handing over. So, thanks. The kind of origins of the project lie in a symposium that we co-organised in November 2021 under the auspices of the Hacklet Society, and you'll be hearing more about the Hacklet Society in a few minutes. That's our conference poster on the left. And the kind of theme of the conference, as you can see, was Decolonising Travel Studies, Sources and Approaches. And our kind of starting point was that the study of the history of travel and the study of both travel and travel writing is inextricable from the structures of colonialism and empire. So we're thinking about how the field of travel studies itself and the way it's been kind of constituted and the way in which it operates has been fundamentally shaped by colonialism and empire. And that kind of plays out in a couple of ways, I think. One way is the way in which the travels of white European men tend to take centre stage, while the travels of other groups are more likely to be sort of marginalised and erased from the historical record, right? So kind of a certain kind of person that's perceived as a traveller and certain kinds of sort of travel writing that are privileged over others. And I think the second thing is the way in which, just historically, we've tended to think about travel in terms of sort of discovery and exploration, these kind of discourses of discovery that are really closely tied to the kind of colonial and imperial exploration just historically. And so that was kind of our starting observation and the impetus for the conference, symposium, and what we were trying to do in it was to kind of reflect on those relationships between travel and colonialism and think about how the field could go about moving past that. How have the kind of methods and theoretical approaches that the field uses sort of worked to exclude certain groups? How could we develop new approaches and turn to new sources to think about making the field of travel studies itself sort of decolonised, more inclusive, and so on. And so, just at the bottom here, I've mentioned a couple of things that the papers at the symposium did to, as a kind of starting point for doing this kind of decolonising. One was sort of looking back at records of European travel and trying to think about how we could pluralise the perspectives that we obtained from it. So how do we go about looking at the history of European travel differently in order to draw out different things from it? But secondly, how can we go about using finding new sources and new case studies of underrepresented histories of travel? Are there travels of certain groups of people that haven't been looked at? Are there certain kinds of sources that haven't been looked at? How can we sort of think more expansively about travel and travel writing in order to decolonise the field? Started out with the symposium. We're now co-editing a couple of things. One is a special issue and one is an edited volume. And those two publications will bring together papers from the symposium which do this kind of work. What I'm going to do is say a little bit about how we're thinking about the relationship between travel studies and decolonial thought. Because kind of one of the main avenues we are using to sort of go about decolonising travel studies is by bringing it into dialogue with decolonial thought. So I should say there's lots of excellent and really useful scholarship on travel and travel writing, kind of from, I suppose, the 1990s in particular. There's lots of sort of post-colonial and new historicist scholarship that try to think about these relationships, about the relationships between travel and colonialism. And so in a way, what we're doing is building on some of that work. And I suppose there's sort of pros and cons to that post-colonial scholarship. It did a very good job at identifying some of those connections between travel and colonialism, but it maybe was less successful in developing new approaches to the field, to the subject. And so I've got a quotation from Mary Louise Pratt at the top here, where she's reflecting on the fact that scholarship on travel writing stayed stuck looking over the shoulders of travelling Europeans, thereby reproducing the imperial relations that were under examination. Right? So she's sort of saying that earlier post-colonial scholarship had its uses, but it nonetheless continued to centre the travels of white Europeans, and so didn't do enough to kind of move the field forward, if you will. And that's sort of what we're trying to do with this project, by bringing it into conversation with decolonial thought. And so what is decolonial thought? As I've got here, it's not a single unified theory, but a set of interrelated theoretical positions characterised by a commitment to undoing the dehumanising practices and logics of colonialism and imagining alternatives to them. And so I suppose, we've been thinking a lot in this session about knowledge, right? We've heard from our UCL colleagues about epistemic justice, and I think one of the really useful things that decolonial thought does is to think about coloniality as a form of epistemic injustice, right? And so we found that very useful in sort of thinking about how decolonial thought sort of offers alternative frameworks, alternative epistemologies, alternative cosmologies for thinking about travel and travel writing. So yeah, these connections between travel, colonialism, and the production of knowledge all come into play in the papers that we're editing. Yeah, and I think one of the main insights of decolonial thought has to do with how coloniality establishes hierarchies of knowledge, which privilege Western epistemes while degrading or erasing others, including indigenous knowledges. And so, yeah, the kind of papers in both our special issue and the edited volume draw on examples of travel, histories of travel, travel writing, bringing them into conversation with aspects of decolonial thought in order to sort of think about, where has the field come from, what's happening in travel studies, where does it need to go next. What I've done here is just given you a brief overview of some of the key themes and ideas that our contributors are thinking about. I'm not going to read them out, but as you can see, they're kind of questions about knowledge, they're questions about agency, they're questions about how have indigenous and colonised peoples and their agencies been marginalised or erased, and how do we go about correcting that? There's thinking about sources, as I mentioned before, in terms of engaging with questions of genre and medium. So many of our contributors are really thinking about travel in a quite expansive sense, I suppose. So there's people are thinking about museums and architecture and the internet and visual art as sources for the history of travel. Yeah, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you. So there are...
Do you want me to?
I'm quite happy to. Yeah, thanks. There are three different dimensions actually to our project. So the one which Natalya spoke about is to do with us as researchers of travel study, travel writing, histories of travel. There's the dimension of us as teachers, thinking about how the disciplinary knowledge in... So Natalya works in English literature, I'm a historian, but also many other fields and many other disciplines. We have come to understand that travelers and the ideas about the world that were sort of constructed in the process of colonial travel have been very foundational to the development of a lot of disciplinary sort of knowledges. So that's another aspect, us as teachers and practitioners. But the third is our role within an institution. Natalya mentioned it, the Hackett Society, which was co-sponsoring the symposium that we organized on the occasion of its 175th anniversary. So it was founded in 1846. So this is a Victorian organization, but it still is very active. It's a publisher of primary accounts of travel and exploration, and Natalya and I are both serving on its council. So in that sense, this is also about decolonizing institutions and having conversations about institutional change from the inside out, meeting resistance to that. We are seeking to engage people in the society who are perhaps less comfortable with this idea, with thinking about how this organization itself is very intimately shaped throughout its history by its connections with the actual colonial past, and how the legacies of that are actually still very much shaping what the organization is doing in the present. And we seek to push the organization towards maybe reconceptualizing what they see as their remit. So sort of to give you a bit of an overview, it was founded in 1846. Since then, this organization has published about 2 volumes a year, so we are looking at 300 plus volumes to date. It is named after an Elizabethan editor of travel accounts named Richard Hakluyt, who is one of the founding figures when we think of the publication of materials, historical materials to do with travel. And when the Hakluyt Society was set up in the 19th century, they were seeking to extend the legacy of Richard Hakluyt, and what they said, save from oblivion some of the sort of heroic deeds of travelers from the past, particularly British, more wider European. It was never limited strictly to just that, but in practice it was primarily limited to just that. So we have very few of those volumes that actually are looking at travelers who are not European. And to the shame of this organization, I think we should say, so far it have only been male travelers. So none of the 300 so many volumes have centered a woman traveler. Many of the people who were part of this organization when it was founded in the 19th century, but actually all the way up to the late 20th century, were people who were themselves either colonial officials or former colonial officials. So from the beginning, people with roots in the East India Company, in the India Office, very close links also with the Royal Geographical Society. And particularly in the 19th century, the idea of this organization was that the study of travel of the past would serve the purposes of further exploration, particularly colonial exploration in the present. So our sort of argument here is that one, the society's close entanglement with British colonialism has substantially shaped the society's publication record. The kind of materials that they chose were worthy of publication, the ones that they conceived of as historically significant, but particularly those that are connected to the sort of the foundational moments of European discovery, which often is used as a euphemism for colonial expansion and colonial violence. The primary source record that we therefore still have today at our disposal as educators is very much co-constitutive of this history of legitimizing and glorifying particular forms of colonial travel, and thereby also marginalizing what Natalya was explaining to us, other historical actors and alternative narratives. So because of the fact that we are, we might say this is 19th and 20th century stuff, well, one, it's still ongoing, but two, it's those materials that we actually use also as researchers and teachers. And therefore, the society has shaped dominant understandings of travel, and we feel that we need to sort of address this issue head on. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of editorial materials. So starting with some 19th century examples of thinking of colonialism under the rubric of discovery. So here we're looking at Sir Walter Raleigh, a famous 16th century proponent of colonization. And this is actually edited by a man called Robert Schomburg, who himself was also an explorer, but in the 19th century in Guyana. So this is one of the things that we very often see, that people who themselves had practical experience in colonial administration, in colonial exploration, were seeking to sort of canonize these earlier travelers and creating a direct link between this 16th or 17th century past and their own moment of Victorian expansion. So, here this is about celebrating the prowess of the maritime discoverers from the Elizabethan age, particularly those who established the British colonies. And I also highlighted this notion, the beneficial results. There's typically no consideration of all the genocidal components of the discovery of the New World. This is celebrated, the honor of being the founder of a colonial empire. So this is indeed mid-19th century, but those perspectives, those views actually continue to carry on in this organization. That's one of the things we seek to address. Another example, again, from the 19th century, which is about Columbus, which again says, you know, there hasn't been a greater moment in history than the discovery of the New World, the incalculable advantages which it has opened up to the world at large. Again, this erasure of the violence that was very much part and parcel of these stories. Here we are looking at Sir Robert Clements Markham, who was a president of the Hakluyt Society as well as of the Royal Geographical Society. He himself was also a big sponsor of different forms of exploration, including Arctic exploration. We are actually looking here at a sort of a miniature model of a sort of an Arctic explorer. He was one of the driving forces, again, behind Robert Scott's expedition, for instance. And here he is essentially stressing the importance of the work in editing travel texts for explorers in his own day. And he is citing an example of Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, a very imperialist Viceroy of India. And, you know, Markham essentially is self-congratulating here at the Hakluyt Society by saying when a thorough geographer such as Lord Curzon goes to explore a new country, the volumes issued by the Hakluyt Society become a necessity to them. Another example of another president of the Hakluyt Society, this is on the tercentenary of the death of Hakluyt, so 300 years after he died, where, again, it's this account of Hakluyt as an apostle of colonization who prepared the ground, essentially, for the British Empire. In many ways, what they were doing is not just claiming the legacy of Hakluyt, but also framing it for their own purposes, because the sort of linear relationship that they draw is also in some ways a kind of a wishful thinking in the service of early 20th century, in this case, celebration of the British Empire. I'm fast forwarding a bit to the sort of later 20th century, when obviously this kind of celebration of colonialism had become much more contested, much more disputed by critical scholarship. This is from 1980. So, for instance, we can think of Said's Orientalism being published in 1978. So it's in this period where post-colonial critiques started to become loud enough for people also in the Hakluyt Society to needing to respond to that. But typically in this period, they would dismiss this as, in this case, what this is an annual lecture where she calls it facile iconoclasm, and we of the Hakluyt Society are not concerned with that. Another example, very similar in tone, this is from the 150th anniversary of the Society in 1996, where then President Paul Hare says, okay, sure, past editions have here and there tended to smack a bit of imperial triumphalism. However, the pendulum has swung to the point that nowadays the anti-colonial critiques are taking it a step too far. And then he says, you know, as a sort of a call to future historians to redeem or set the record straight and say that eventually we will detect that the negative aspects of the historical processes, so he speaks about colonialism here, have also been exaggerated. Similarly for ideological and racist advantage, so playing the sort of reverse racism card here. We just wanted to sort of present this to you as a practical example of some of the work we're doing with an institution, particularly highlighting the prominent role that institutions such as this play in the curation of a primary source record, a collection that, like any other collections, like any museum collection or archive, is never neutral or apolitical. It's always the result of selection. It's always the result of the prejudices and the preconceptions and the priorities of the people who have curated it. And then we also think that in order to sort of move out of this, we should be thinking of travel as something that is uncoupled from notions of discovery, geographical novelty, or particularly interest as judged primarily through this very limited white male European lens. So we originally had a 45-minute workshop scheduled. Then we were asked to do this in half that time. So therefore, the workshop aspect of it we can't really do. But I do want to leave you with some of the questions and the handouts that we brought. I think we probably have 5 minutes for people to look at it. So I'll give them out. It's 4 pages, and I think I've got 10 sets. So maybe per pair, you can take 4 pages and take it back. And then maybe whilst we do that, so some of the questions that we had, and they're also there written, are could you maybe think about the way that travel, particularly of a colonial nature, has the role that it has played in the production of knowledge in your own disciplines? How have your own views and sort of understanding of the world been shaped by travel writing? And maybe Natalya could just say something briefly about the excerpts that we chose.
Sure. So we've got a few questions for you on this handout. You've seen 2 of them already, and we've also got a couple of excerpts from texts that are to do with travel and colonialism. And so the first one is a section of an essay published in Nanjala Nyabola's collection Travelling While Black. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. It's a really excellent essay collection published in 2020. Nyabola is a Kenyan writer and humanitarian who's done lots of work. She's quite a prolific traveller, but has also done lots of work in the field of migration and work with refugees and migrants. The essay that we've given you is it's the sort of titular essay in the collection. It's called Travelling While Black. And it talks about how her own experiences of travelling the world as a black woman cause her to sort of reflect on and reconsider the ways in which, the ways in which travel continues to be shaped, by the structures of sort of colonialism and racism. And she talks in particular about the ways in which travel guides structure and shape our perception of the world.
So that's the first excerpt. The second one that we selected is by Haunani K. Trask, who she passed away a couple of years back, a Hawaiian indigenous rights activist. And this is from, it's an essay from a volume that she published in the 1990s. It's from 1993, so 30 years ago now. From Native Daughter, Colonialism and Sovereignty in Hawaii, where she is addressing the erasure of the fact that Hawaii is a U.S. colony in narratives that have repackaged Hawaii for tourist consumption. And she calls this the prostitution of indigenous culture. And she's criticizing the ways how, the appropriation of Hawaiian land is not acknowledged, B, how Hawaiians are made to perform their culture for the tourist gaze, and 3, how tourism also has led to lots and lots of socio-economic issues to do with the fact that land and property prices have gone up to the extent that it has actually pushed indigenous Hawaiians outside of the lands that used to be those of their ancestors. And she ends on a very sort of direct, confronting note where she says to the reader, now that you have read A Native View, let me just leave this thought with you. If you're thinking of visiting my homeland, please do not. We do not want or need any more tourists, and we certainly do not like them. If you want to help our cause, pass this on to your friends. So I think it's something that also makes us think about how, as a tourist, we are ourselves also implicated in some of the structures that, in this case, are part of post-colonial but still colonial dynamics of dispossession. So something for us all, I think, to to consider our own sort of ways of being implicated in, complicit in ongoing colonial structures that govern travel.
Given the time, I think just a round of applause, please.